A true city of promise, as the mayor used to say during his campaign speeches. Now those same streets are full of voices, but not the kind you'd want to hear. The choir is what they call them. Not the survivors, there aren't many of us left to name anything, but the ones who didn't make it. They hum, sing, and chant in eerie, melodic tones, a song that spreads across the city like a plague of sound. The parasites that infest them burrow deep, taking control, making them instruments of their will. And their music? It's beautiful, haunting, like something out of a dream that you don't want to wake up from. I've learned to block it out, mostly. My mind is hardened now, but it wasn't always like this. The first time I heard the song, I almost didn't make it. It had started quietly enough, like most things do before they spiral out of control. The city wasn't always silent, wasn't always full of that creeping dread where every footstep feels like a gunshot in the night. No, back then everything was still loud. I still had friends, I still had family. The first report came on the news one evening. Just a little blip on the radar. Unexplained illness sweeps small neighborhood in the North District. The talking head anchor had her trademark concerned expression plastered on, but you could tell she didn't care. Nothing ever happened in the North District that mattered. Just old people, workers, low-income families, a few sicknesses here or there wasn't going to stir up much attention. A week later, the reports started to get stranger. People weren't just getting sick, they were changing. They were singing. I remember watching a grainy video that someone posted online, filmed on a shaky phone in the middle of the night. The clip showed a woman standing in the middle of a street, her head tilted back, mouth wide open, singing in a high, lilting tone that sent chills down my spine. Her voice echoed through the empty streets, and the video ended abruptly when the person filming started screaming. The woman turned toward them, her eyes glazed over, but still aware, hungry. That video got taken down not long after, but I couldn't shake it. The sound of her voice haunted me. It was too perfect, too calculated, like it wasn't human at all. By the time people realized what was happening, it was already too late. The North District was locked down, then the East, and then the whole city. The parasites didn't spread through air or water. No, their weapon was much more insidious. They infected people with sound. The parasites lived in their songs, in their voices, and once you heard the song, once you really heard it, they got into you. They started small. One person would start humming, another would respond, unknowingly locking themselves into the rhythm. Soon, they were singing together, harmonizing. They'd spread it to anyone who listened. The government tried to quarantine the city, but how do you quarantine sound? The streets were filled with songs, and once the choir had enough voices, it was like the city itself had become one living, breathing instrument. You couldn't go anywhere without hearing that damned melody. You couldn't step outside without risking exposure to the song. That's when people started dying. I don't know when exactly the parasites showed up, but I remember the moment I realized what they were doing. My little sister Rachel had come back from a rescue center they'd set up on the outskirts of town. She'd gotten a cold, or so we thought. I was one of the last to see her normal. She'd been humming when she came home, just a small tune under her breath. At first, I didn't think anything of it. She'd always loved music, loved filling the silence with little melodies. But this time, the tune was different. It was slower, more deliberate, like it was pulling something out of me. She'd looked at me that night with this strange smile on her face, like she wasn't really there. "Come sit with me," she'd said, her voice soft, melodic. I didn't respond at first, but she kept going. "Sing with me." I don't know why, but something deep inside me screamed to run. It was like a primal instinct, a voice in my head telling me that whatever was happening to her wasn't Rachel anymore. I'd backed away, shaking my head, trying not to listen to the tune slipping from her lips. That's when I saw it, the thing writhing under her skin. A lump, a shape moving beneath her scalp, right at the base of her skull. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did, but it didn't matter to her anymore. She was already gone. Now I keep to myself. My apartment is buried deep in the heart of the city, far enough from the main roads that I don't hear the choir as loudly. But it's still there, always there, humming beneath the surface, waiting for me to slip up. I haven't spoken in, I don't know how long. Days? The calendar on my wall says it's been months since the outbreak, but Time doesn't make sense anymore. The only thing that matters now is staying quiet, staying invisible. Most of the city's population is gone now. Dead or taken by the choir, their bodies still walking the streets, still singing. You can see them sometimes through the windows, their heads tilted back, eyes glazed over, mouths open wide as they sing their haunting melodies. If you listen too closely, you'll hear the others respond. You'll hear the harmony. I haven't looked out the window in days. The hardest part isn't the loneliness. No, I was always a bit of a loner, even before all this. The hardest part is the silence. The city used to be so loud, so full of life and chaos. Now, it's like the air itself is afraid to move, afraid to disturb the choir. There's no more traffic, no more honking horns, no more shouting, just the song, always the song. I found an old radio yesterday while scavenging in an abandoned shop. It was one of those portable ones, the kind people used to take to the beach or picnics. I almost left it behind, but something about it called to me. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I hadn't heard a human voice, a real human voice, in so long. I brought it back to my apartment, set it on the floor in the corner, and stared at it for hours before I worked up the courage to turn it on. The static crackled to life immediately, filling the room with the familiar white noise that was almost comforting in its emptiness. I turned the dial, slowly at first, afraid of what I might find. Nothing, just more static. And then, faintly, I heard it. A voice, "We're still here, survivors, outskirts of the city. Respond, please respond." I froze, my hand hovering over the volume dial. The voice was weak, distant, like it was coming from miles away. But it was real. It was human. My throat ached with the effort of holding back the urge to respond. I wanted to call out, wanted to scream into that crackling void and tell them I was still alive, still here. But I knew better. I couldn't respond. Not with my voice. I grabbed a notebook and scribbled down the frequency. Maybe I could find a way to get a message to them later. For now, I had to focus on staying safe. The next morning, I heard footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was just another one of the choir, wandering the streets like they always do. But these steps were different. They were slow, hesitant, like someone was trying not to make any noise. I pressed myself against the wall, heart racing, listening as the footsteps grew closer. They stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the song, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a soft knock. "Hello?" a voice whispered, barely audible. Is anyone in there?" I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to stay silent, to ignore the voice. But my heart told me this was different. This wasn't one of them. This was someone like me. The knock came again, a little louder this time. "Please, I know you're in there. I won't hurt you. I need help." I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards or distant hum from the city set my nerves on edge. My mind kept replaying that voice outside the door. It was human. No, it sounded human. But that melody, that faint note of something sinister, told me otherwise. They were getting smarter, more cunning. The parasites had learned how to mimic us, and now they were trying to lure us out of hiding. I spent hours pacing the room, the weight of silence pressing down on me like a physical force. The more I tried to think, the more it became impossible to focus. My instincts screamed at me to stay quiet, to not even breathe too loudly. But at the same time, my need for connection, any connection, was gnawing at me. I hadn't spoken in so long. Not a single word. I hadn't even whispered to myself, for fear that the parasites could hear me, that they would sense the vibrations in the air and come for me. There was no telling how close they were, how many were out there. They moved through the city like a slow plague, infecting everything in their path, but always singing, always calling for more voices to join the choir. The radio was still sitting on the floor, the soft crackle of static filling the room with its dull, comforting buzz. I looked over at it, the notebook lying beside it with the frequency I'd written down. Could I contact the people I'd heard? What if it was a real signal, real survivors trying to find others? But even if it was, could I risk it? I reached for the radio, my fingers brushing against the dial, hesitating. What if there were more people like me out there, alone and afraid, hiding in silence? But what if this was another trap? The parasites had taken my sister, they'd taken almost everyone I knew, and they had no intention of stopping. I couldn't let my guard down now. But then, what if I was the last one left? The next day, I decided to leave the apartment. I'd been cooped up in that tiny room for too long, and supplies were running low. If I didn't get food and water soon, I wouldn't last much longer. I didn't like the idea of leaving. Outside, the city was a maze of danger, of echoes and voices that could turn on you at any moment. But the parasites weren't the only threat. Desperation was sinking in everywhere. Those who weren't taken by the choir were just as dangerous, starving, paranoid, willing to do anything to survive. I wasn't sure what was worse, the infected or the ones trying to avoid being infected. I pulled on my jacket, slipped my knife into the waistband of my pants, and packed a small bag with what little I had left. 2 cans of food, a bottle of water, and some old crackers I'd found in a cupboard. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I couldn't risk carrying more. The weight of the bag would slow me down. The streets were deserted when I stepped outside. No cars, no people, just the faint hum of electricity from the broken streetlights and the occasional sound of wind whistling through the abandoned buildings. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. Every step I took felt amplified, like the city itself was listening to me. I stayed close to the walls, ducking into alleyways and shadows whenever possible. The main streets were too exposed, and even though I couldn't hear the choir's song at that moment, I knew they were out there, lurking in the corners of the city, waiting for someone, anyone, to slip up. As I walked, I tried not to think about the places I passed. The grocery store where I used to buy my groceries. The park where I'd once met friends for late-night drinks. The school where I used to teach. All of it was gone now. After what felt like hours, I found myself at the old public library. The front doors were still intact, though the windows were cracked, the glass dirty and streaked with dust. It had been a while since I'd seen anyone come here. The idea of searching the library for supplies was absurd, but I wasn't looking for food this time. I needed something else, something to keep my mind from falling apart. I pushed open the door as quietly as possible and stepped inside. The smell of old books and mildew hit me immediately, familiar yet unsettling. Rows of shelves stood like sentinels, silent and towering in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. I made my way to the back, where the reference section used to be. It was quieter there, less exposed. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A distraction maybe, something to occupy my mind, something that wasn't about survival or the constant threat of death. I needed to remember who I was before this, before the choir, before the silence took over. But as I scanned the shelves, a strange sound caught my attention. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but it made my blood run cold. Humming, I froze, my hand halfway to a book on the shelf. The sound was faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the library, but it was unmistakable. A soft, lilting tune carried on the air like a breeze through the trees. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I knew what it meant. They were here. I pressed myself against the nearest shelf, trying to stay as still as possible, straining to hear. The humming grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow as I clutched the knife at my side, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good. The parasites didn't care about weapons. They didn't care about anything except the song. I could hear footsteps now, soft and deliberate, moving through the aisles. Someone was walking through the library, humming to themselves, as if they were completely unaware of the danger they posed. Or maybe they weren't unaware at all. Maybe they were just waiting for someone to respond. I ducked behind a row of shelves, crouching low as I peeked around the corner. A figure was moving through the stacks, their back turned to me. A woman, by the looks of it, wearing a long coat that trailed behind her as she moved. She was humming softly, her voice carrying through the empty space like a lullaby. But there was something off about the way she moved. Too slow, too measured. She turned slightly and I caught a glimpse of her face, pale, gaunt, her eyes glazed over, unseeing. The parasites had taken her. I pulled back, my breath catching in my throat. If she heard me, if she saw me, it would be over. The moment I responded, even involuntarily, the parasites would sink their claws into my mind. They'd make me sing too. I stayed hidden, waiting for her to pass. The humming faded as she moved further down the aisle, and I let out a slow, shaky breath. I needed to get out of here. Now, I turned to leave, but my foot caught on something, a loose book lying on the floor. It skidded across the tile with a loud scrape, the sound echoing through the silent library. The humming stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then slowly I heard the footsteps change direction. She was coming for me. I bolted. There was no time to be quiet, no time to think. I sprinted down the aisle, weaving between shelves as fast as I could, my boots slapping against the floor. Behind me, I could hear her footsteps quicken, her humming turning into something more urgent, more insistent. The doors were just ahead. If I could make it outside, I might have a chance. But as I reached the entrance, the woman's voice rose to a piercing note, the melody twisting into something sharp and discordant. I could feel it crawling inside my head, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, trying to worm its way in. I slammed through the doors and into the street, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. The humming was still there, still in my mind, but I forced myself to focus. I couldn't stop now. I had to keep running. I didn't stop until I was far enough from the library that the humming faded into the distance. My chest heaved, my legs burning from the sprint, but I was alive. For now, I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep running, hiding, waiting for the inevitable. The choir was everywhere, and they were getting smarter. The parasites were learning, adapting, and there was no way to tell who was infected until it was too late. I had to leave the city. That night, I lay in my bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling. The radio crackled softly in the corner, but I didn't turn it on. The silence felt suffocating, but the alternative was worse. I thought about the people I'd left behind. My sister, my friends, the ones who hadn't made it, the ones who had been taken by the song. I couldn't stay here, not anymore. The city was dead, and it was only a matter of time before the parasites claimed the last of us. But where would I go? The quarantine zones had failed, the government had pulled out, and there was no one left to help. The parasites were spreading, and soon there wouldn't be anywhere left to run. But I couldn't give up. Not yet. I grabbed my notebook, flipping to the page where I'd written down the radio frequency. There had to be someone out there, someone who could help, someone who hadn't been taken by the choir. I switched on the radio, tuning it to the frequency. The static buzzed in my ears, but after a few moments, I heard the voice again. "We're still here, survivors, outskirts of the city. Respond." I didn't hesitate this time. I picked up the radio's microphone and pressed the button to transmit, but I didn't speak. I couldn't. Instead, I tapped out a simple message in Morse code. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short. SOS, the static crackled for a moment, and then, faintly, a reply came through. "Hold on, we're coming." I didn't know if I could trust them. I didn't know if they were real or if this was just another trap, but I had no choice. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a glimmer of hope. I had to believe that there was still a way out, a way to survive, and until then, I would keep moving. In silence, the days that followed were a blur of careful planning, packed bags, and tense silence. I'd made up my mind. I was leaving Albright City. No more waiting for the choir to find me. I'd find the survivors, the ones who'd responded to my call. If they were real, if they weren't just another part of the nightmare, then they were my only hope. But leaving the city wouldn't be easy. The streets were littered with the infected, their melodic whispers always on the edge of hearing. I had to plan my route carefully, avoid the main roads where the choir gathered in larger numbers. The city had become a massive, living organism, and I was a tiny, insignificant cell trying to escape its grasp. 3 days later, I stood at the edge of the city, looking out at the wasteland that stretched before me. Beyond the crumbling buildings and twisted streets, I could see the faint outline of the quarantine wall, still standing in the distance. It was the barrier that had once been meant to contain the infection, to protect the rest of the world from the choir. Now it was nothing more than a reminder of the failure to stop the spread. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the broken pavement. I tightened the straps on my backpack and took a deep breath. I'd made it this far, but I knew the hardest part was yet to come. The parasites weren't just in the city. They were everywhere. I had to be careful, had to stay quiet. One slip, one sound, and it would all be over. I took one last look at Albright City before turning away. It was time to go.